Państwa, zaczniemy trzecią część naszego spotkania.
So let us start the third part of our meeting. Let's wait for our kind colleagues. We're all back. So, the last part of our meeting I'd like to devote to matters of reception of the liberation of Nazi camps today in mass culture, in films. I think that all of us remember one of the episodes of the series was translated as Band of Brothers, and one of the episodes has a very important title, Why We Fight. Because I believe reminding everyone about the liberation of concentration camps at the end of the war, both by allies, Americans, and also and Russia, clearly illustrates the reason of conducting the war because for many Americans, a trip through the Atlantic to Europe was not that obvious, right? Their need to send our boys, as they say, to some war, to some distant country. And seeing those scenes in the video when American troops enter quite the Dachau sub-camp Kaffen4, we can then understand the meaning of that crusade to Europe as Eisenhower General described it. In Russia and the Soviet Union earlier, also, it was underlined very strongly the role of the Red Army, the soldiers that delivered freedom to the prisoners of concentration camps. But if we trace, you could say, the combat orders of particular units, be it Soviet or Western allies, the concentration camps were not some special points around which there was supposed to be the development of the attack. There were no objectives, there were not targets put before military commanders. When the soldiers entered the area of camps, in terms of camps in contemporary Poland, prisoners, there were not many prisoners. In Auschwitz, there were 7,000 about. But the biggest problem was that those Allied soldiers were confronted with in the Western Germany, Bergen-Belsen, there was a problem what to do with the huge amount of corpses, with the huge amount of the sick, and how to provide help effectively. And therefore, I kindly ask Ms. Elke to take the floor. No microphone?
Yes, again, I would like to show you, because Bergen-Belsen here is also different to the other camps, because after what I told you, I don't know why it doesn't want to work. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Like this. In the month after the liberation, in the next month, there are still people dying. 14,000 people die in the time after April 15th. And what the British does, on the one hand, to prevent more diseases, but also as a sign of, to have no remainings left, is they burn down all the remaining barracks from the concentration camp. They bring 29,000 survivors to a newly created hospital in the barracks that belonged to the German army nearby. Bergen-Belsen had been a training camp for the German army, and now it is used by the British as a displaced persons camp. There is a Polish DP camp with approximately 10,000 Polish survivors until 1946. They then go back to Poland. And there's a Jewish DP camp with approximately 12,000 survivors there who remain in Bergen-Belsen until 1950, which is a very long period. And it means that Bergen-Belsen, here you have a picture of a wedding, a marriage. And that means that already right after the liberation, there is a new narrative beginning, a narrative also of hope, because there are many survivors who have lost their first family, their women, their husbands, and they go to the rabbi in Celle and ask him to cancel their marriage in order to be able to marry someone new. And there's many survivors getting married and having children right there in the camp. Bergen-Belsen, the DP camp, is a place of culture, is a place of highly motivated political activities. The first Jewish Congress in the territory of occupied Germany takes place in Bergen-Belsen. They make exhibitions on the history of the camp, of the concentration camp. They make theater plays, the famous KZ theater that you might have heard of. So there is a completely new culture which begins in this period. And what is very essential to what you said, Dr. Setkiewicz, is that it's the survivors who create the first memorial signs in Bergen-Belsen. It's very hard to see here, but I chose this picture to show you that Bergen-Belsen is more or less a cemetery today, with the big mass graves and with monuments that were like a wooden cross that was installed by the Polish survivors, and a Jewish monument created already in 1945 by the Jewish survivors. And I mentioned this because in our German narrative, it's very often forgotten. You know, we have the narrative that German is perfect in their dealing with the past. We have so many memorial sites and so on, but people really tend to forget that this wouldn't be possible without having had the survivors who already from the first moment fought to have memorial sites in these places. Maybe so much to now.
Jeszcze, jeśli można, mam jedno pytanie.
If I may, I have one question. Madam, would you please clarify why so long it took this process of restoring to real life of Jewish prisoners, camp for displaced persons, the DPs, Buchenwald, Edenbelsen, sorry, existed for very long, right? Until 50, the United. Why it took so long? Why it happened?
It took so long because of two reasons. The first one is that in difference to many other survivors, the Jewish survivors didn't have a place where to go. They had lost, especially in Eastern European countries, all their homes, their families. Many of them were left or survived alone. All their families had been killed. And we know, or you know also, that there were waves of anti-Semitism in other countries. So many of them didn't want to go back to the countries where they had come from originally. And they were trying to go to other countries. And especially in Bergen-Belsen, Palestine was one origin where they wanted to go. And we had the situation that the British were the ones who had occupied this area, Lower Saxony, and the British were also the ones who were ruling in Palestine. And so there were huge demonstrations in order to get the permission to immigrate to Palestine. You might know the history of the Exodus, the ship who left to Palestine and where the survivors weren't allowed to go in. So this is one main aspect, that there were no places where these people could go for such a long time.
Dziękuję bardzo. A teraz bardzo przejdźmy
Thank you very much. Now let's move on to Buchenwald. What was the situation there? And also, I would be very grateful for a few words of commentary regarding the SS men, the crew of this camp. What was their fate? Was it possible to, in Buchenwald, capture them? Because after the liberation of the camp?
Yeah, thank you. I can, so the next picture fits, in fact, because as you can see, they are sitting on some days after the liberation. I'm sorry, this is on the 11th of April, 1945. Some SS men in the field, not far away from the camp, and they were captured by some prisoners. Yeah, later about 80 people were given to the, as I told you, to the Americans. And later, there were also trials. One famous trial began exactly 2 years later, on 11th of April, 47 in Dachau. There some dozen of SS men, former SS men, were sentenced to different punishments. But I can tell you maybe one actual number I would like to give you, because we speak about 9,000 SS men and guards. So not only SS men, but also other perpetrators from other organizations, but guarding the camp here. And we know that 79 were sentenced to a kind of punishment, yeah, so that they got a punishment after 1945. So the number is extremely low, and it's a disaster, in fact, also especially for the survivors of the camps. So yeah, this maybe to give you a statistic. I also had some pictures I wanted to show you, but it goes also a bit into the direction what Dr. Gryglewski said, that the saving of lives is the most important at the beginning after the liberation. We also know that the former SS barrack, I'm sitting in one at the moment, my office is in a former SS barrack, was also used as a lazaret, as ambulance hospitals for the quick supply of people. But of course, in a lot of cases, it didn't help anymore. I will show you later also a picture. The camp had to be managed, of course, this was a cooperation between the Americans. You see here the first commander of the Americans, Schmuel was his name, Lawrence C. Schmuel, together with representatives of the International Camp Committee. They are discussing what to do for the camp, but they also could use also structures which were established even before the liberation. Maybe interesting, of course, they used everything, the villages, the towns, city of Weimar, to bring food and everything up to the mountain, the Ettersberg mountain. Here you see an SS man captured also by prisoners and survivors, better to say. And Hofschulte was his name, a higher SS rank, who later died in a camp for prisoners of war, as we know. So this is the bigger question we also make strong here in Buchenwald in our work. What happened to these people, and why in the German societies, and because we have two, in fact, only less people, where only a few people got trials. So these bigger questions, the documentation, the reporting you mentioned already. So I would a bit go on, but think also about the war commissions, of the Americans, for example. They are also very important, going into the camps and taking pictures, but also saving evidence for coming trials, maybe. So we have pictures of them, and also confronting the population. This is maybe famous also, that people from Weimar, about 1,000 were confronted in Buchenwald with the atrocities, and they are standing here on the roll call ground, and probably it smells. And in other pictures you also can see that they are shocked. And Margaret Bork White, a very famous war correspondent of the United States, She said later she learned the German words for wir haben das nicht gewusst. We didn't know about that. So these, something what, maybe not only in Weimar, she realized already before, because we have to think bigger that in German society, a lot of people didn't want to know about it. In fact, although they knew more than they argued. Work was done in the camp, in the liberated camp. It had to be cleaned. It had to be, in a way, the barracks were not burnt in Buchenwald in this way. But for example, women from Weimar were brought up to the mountain to make food for the survivors. But also men were used, as you can see here, for digging holes in graves for these people who did not survive the camp, in fact, and died after the liberation of the camp. In Buchenwald, more than 700 people died after the liberation. The children, such a big topic in Buchenwald, what happened to them, and I can only tell you that the way of orphanages and different places in France and Switzerland, in the case of Buchenwald, but also in England, were used, and also it began the question of how to deal with the traumata of these children and teenagers. Drawings played a role. The colleagues from Auschwitz, they know, Thomas G., for example, who painted a lot, also already in Auschwitz, but later in Buchenwald and after the liberation. So such a topic. And dying, in fact, this person you can see here is Alfred Delier. He is a 46-year-old man from Belgium, husband, father, and he died 2 days after this picture was taken on the 26th of April, 1945. So many topics we talk about the time of liberation, although in general, we have also to tell from the Buchenwald perspective that we do not know too much about the time of the DP camp. Also this time there's research needed still for these months till end of July 1945, when the Soviets took over the camp, the former camp, and used it as a special internment camp for Germans, for National Socialists mainly. And the second big story we tell in Buchenwald also about this Soviet period. But first of all, also this commemoration, which took part, this official event here on the 19th of April, some days after the liberation. And via loudspeakers, the people who were not able to walk could listen also to this event. And so commemorating on the one hand, but also forgetting. So which groups of people already during this kind of official ceremony were already not mentioned, or like Jewish people, for example, as we know, like Sinti Roma. So with the remembering begins also the forgetting, which can be a topic. And maybe not the last picture, but also Soviet survivors, what happened to them. The ways are so different of people home. Did they want to go home to this country, or did they even fear, especially when they were prisoners of war? And probably you know that filtration camps for these prisoners, and often the Red Army waited very quickly for them, and other problems in their life. The last picture I would like to show you is a picture of a sub-camp, because we often forget in Buchenwald the 28,000 women also, and this is a sub-camp in Penik, which was liberated, and there were also taken pictures. We use a lot here in our pedagogical work to talk about the women. Maybe so far.
Ja jeszcze chciałem zadać pytanie dotyczące sposobów, w jaki
I want to
dzisiaj...
ask the question about the methods that today in Germany, Germans look at matters of industrial use of the inhabitants. In this case of Weimar, for digging, covering the corpses of prisoners of the camp, creating graves. that must have been a traumatic experience. That is it somehow especially commented on? Americans did they have a right to do that?
This is a question, to be honest, I can't answer. We see sometimes very young people also from Weimar on these pictures on these American pictures. There was one American who followed, in fact, this marching group from Weimar, of inhabitants to Buchenwald, and he documented this, and you see children even on that. And of course, you can be critical in a way also with that. But in Weimar, as I know, there were not enough people who said we will go to the Attersberg mountain. So Americans partly punished people, not punished, I'm sorry, forced people also to go up to the mountain, and among them were also very young people. If this made kind of traumata, I'm not sure, because when we talk about Buchenwald, we speak more about the traumata of these people who had for months and years been in these camps. So I think this is rather not a topic, not too much. But maybe Elke, I don't know if you see it in a different way.
Dobrze, to teraz przejdźmy do Sztutowa.
And now we'll move to Sztutów. The situation there was slightly different, but it's also an interesting question, I think. The approach to German civilians to what was happening in the concentration camp right before and right after the liberation. So when it comes to Stutthof, I remember testimonies of prisoners who were in one of the sub-camps in the Sabine Peninsula, and when the war was almost over, when the Soviets were about to capture the area, some of the wardens from the camps fled, and the prisoners, the Jews that were there, left and tried to find some food in the neighboring areas. And some local authorities decided that it's not acceptable that the prisoners walk around, maybe they will loot. So maybe they, forced some Germans with some rifles or whatever to look for the prisoners to capture them. And if some of them were found with some stolen potatoes from a potato field, they were just killed on the spot. So were there any signs of compassion or understanding towards the fate of the prisoners in the Stutthof area? At that time, it was fully German at that time, right? Before I answer your question, so to clarify, I would like to say that in the legal categories, on the day when the Soviet army captured the area of the concentration camp, Stutthof, it was no longer existing. Most of the prisoners have already left the area of the camp. There were around 150 people left there. And the commander of the camp during the sea evacuation informed his superiors that the camp is liquidated and the area and everything was handed over to a Wehrmacht unit. So after the liberation, the question of what happened, for example, with the wardens, does not exist because they fled together with the commander. And the Soviets, when they took over the area of the camp on the 9th of April, told the prisoners that they could leave the camp on that very day and directed them in in the direction of Elbląg, but it's not a story about how generous the Russians were, because there was no generosity here, because very quickly on this route close to Elbląg, an investigative unit, intelligence unit of the Soviets was formed, and this unit was capturing those people and interrogating them, whether these are some capo commanders or some wardens from the camp, or whether they were doing some favors for the Germans, or whether they were members of some anti-communist organizations. So of those 150 people who were in the camp at that time, 23 were captured, and they were convicted, sentenced to 15 or 20 years in the Soviet labor camps. And they returned after more or less 10 years. So that was the fate of the people who were liberated in Stutthof. And when it comes to civilians, I would like to tell you a very interesting story. So shortly after that, I mean, a few days after I became the director of the Stutthof Museum, I was visited by the Minister of Culture in Germany. I'm not going to say his name, and he said that his family came from Elbląg and they knew nothing about the existence of Stutthof. And in Elbląg, there were 2 sub-camps. There were prisoners on the street. So when men were taken to the army, someone had to do cleaning work, repair works, etc. So Stutthof and its area where it was similar. And well, the civilians there were in denial. They did not want to know about it. So yes, of course, it cannot be true, right? But because it's against the facts. When the camp was created in 1939, a propaganda was started. It was said that it's a camp for some particularly dangerous Polish criminals like rapists, arsonists, and so on. So the local people, when someone escaped from the camp, were very diligent and very involved in capturing the prisoners. We actually have some reports and knowledge about one successful case when a prisoner managed to escape the camp. That was actually an uncle of one of our employees who is already retired. So I think the local society was frightened about the consequences. So the first staff involved, the first personnel involved the local people. They were providing services for the camp or the personnel of the camp. So it's not possible that they didn't know. It's, you know, curiosity. So surely questions were asked and there were some answers closer or further from the truth. And there was some sort of awareness. But I also think that the local German population was involved mostly in helping other Germans who came there from the eastern regions. And they did not, you know, pay too much attention to the prisoners themselves. And I think that would be all for your question, Piotr. but to stick to the organizational regime, I try to summarize. So should you need some additional information, let me know. Just two more words about what happened to the area of the Stutthof camp after the end of the war, because this is also a very interesting story. Yeah, that's true. So if he was alive, I mean, the first director of the Stutthof Museum, Mr. Tadeusz Matusiak, he would be 92 years old. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. I had the honor and pleasure to know him and to be friends with him. I'm still in contact with his family, and he told me that from the perspective of the decision makers who were in Warsaw, of course, the Stutthof camp was a camp for rogue Volksdeutsches. So a lot of people signed the Volkslist, they served in the German army and so on. So of course, the story that the Wehrmacht was a national army, and to serve in this army, you had to be a German formally, so people were forced to do that. So we have heard it a lot. So the former prisoners of Stutthof camp fought to organize a memorial site there, and it continued until 1962. After the liberation, there were all kinds of institutions residing here. So at the beginning, there were Soviets, and on the 12th of May, 1945, they appointed a special state commission to identify the conditions, the living conditions and the deaths of the prisoners. So the commission was led by one of the officers of the 48th Soviet Army. And interrogations were made. There were site inspections of the buildings. The infrastructure was almost intact. So only barrack of the political unit was burned, and the Jewish camp was destroyed, plus some explosives were set under the gas chamber and the crematorium. So by chance, only the building of the crematorium and the stack fell down, collapsed. The gas chamber was not destroyed. So the furnaces and the gas chamber survived. And Polish administration, which took over the area of the former Stutthof camp, was not interested in commemorating the site, and for the reasons that were mentioned by Tadeusz Matusiak. But this area was treated as a reservoir of materials that could be used in all sorts of ways. So at the very beginning, in 1946, 30 prefabricated barracks were dismantled. The material was handed over to the destroyed places, villages, and they were used as living quarters or warehouses, and some remained in the camp area and were destroyed. Then the border troops took over this area, and the military unit was stationed there, and it was also an area used for military training. So some equipment was installed there for training soldiers, plus there were patrol dogs kept there. And then the area was used by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and they created a holiday resort there. So people used to come there to relax for holiday. So whatever was left in the camp, like banks, sleeping bags, some furniture, was used as firewood. Basically, everything was destroyed. So when the museum was created, some of the brick buildings were still there in the so-called SS part, plus 4 barracks, 2 which were used by the camp administration, and 2 prison barracks in the area of the new camp. So there was a challenge to tell the story of this place, which was claustrophobic and closed. But when we come there, today you can see a lot of open space. When it's sunny, this area is really nice. So I think that our pedagogists can handle that. We use the know-how that we have. We use the knowledge of Auschwitz-Birkenau or Majdanek Museum as well. And I do appreciate this because our network of museums is very effective. So when the museum was created, there were no artifacts at all. So the museum materials were collected from the prisoners who took some small things from the campgrounds. We found some things during archaeological excavations, but the problem is that when we uncover something underground, we are not really sure if it was something belonging to the prisoners or maybe to the Germans who were fleeing the Eastern Front. And yes, to sum up, I think I managed to answer the auxiliary question in an exhaustive way. And hopefully this gives you a complete picture of the place. So the period of 17 years between the liberation and the establishment of the museum was the second case of forgetting Stutthof. Thank you. And now we go to Majdanek. So Majdanek camp was to a very big extent preserved when it comes to the relics and mementos. So can you please tell us why it happened and why Majdanek became the first place of the first memorial site in Poland? Yes, it is true indeed. The camp buildings in 99% were preserved when Soviet troops entered the camp. And on the 24th of July, 1944, but what happened later in the successive months and years in the camp area unfortunately led to an extensive destruction. So the only building that Germans managed to partially destroy was the building of the new crematorium, and other buildings, including those in the SS part and the prisoner part, were preserved in a very good condition. It was confirmed by the Polish and Soviet Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes, which on 2nd and 3rd of August 1946 made an investigation and a site inspection. And this report includes assessment of the buildings. And according to the assessment, the buildings were preserved in an excellent condition. Today, we can see a different situation. This is related to the history of the camp area after the war. So this area of Lublin camp was taken over by the Soviet army, transformed into military garrisons. Some of the barracks were dedicated to Polish army units forming in Lublin. And in the third prisoner field, an infiltration camp was created for prisoners. And in this camp, soldiers of the resistance movement of the underground army were kept. These were people who actually surrendered themselves. So this camp existed for 4 weeks, and on the 23rd of August, around 250 prisoners were of the Polish underground army were evacuated from this camp. And in field 4 and 5, there was a camp for Volksdeutsches, for soldiers captured in Lublin and its area, plus civilians. And what's also worth mentioning is that right after the Soviet army entering the Majdanek grounds, the grounds were also entered by civilians from Lublin. So Majdanek, for those who were here, it's clear, but for those who have not yet been in our museum, I would like to say that Majdanek is surrounded by a city. It was built at the suburbs of the city first, but it was close to one of the main roads of the city. So the people of Lublin knew what was going on in Majdanek. They were actively involved in helping the prisoners of Majdanek, but of course, throughout the years, they could not see with their own eyes what they heard about. So right after the liberation on the 25th of August, a lot of people, a lot of civilians went to Majdanek, and this uncontrolled activity of civilians and destructive actions by the military unfortunately resulted in extensive destruction. So this area was back then treated not as a memorial site, but as post-German property, which does not have to be respected, which can be used or destroyed. And a flagship example could be the destruction of the third Eagles monument. So there was this initiative to make camp better. So there was a competition between the prisoners, which camp area would be more beautiful. So in one of the camp areas, there was this monument of 3 eagles built with some ashes buried inside. So it was the first mausoleum in the world. It was destroyed by the soldiers. So there were 3 eagles on top of the monument, which they associated with the Third Reich. So the destruction was really extensive. Some of the barracks were dismantled, taken away, used for civilian housing or sold, and a lot of property looted from the prisoners and property of the Reinhardt action victims were stolen or whether distributed to Lublin community as a charity support. So the destruction was growing. And fortunately, it was noticed, and in autumn 1945, work started to create a memorial site and a museum in the former campgrounds. The museum was created at the end of October 1945, and the first director was Antoni Perski. And the tasks of the State Museum in Majdanek were to handle and effectively manage the so-called touristic traffic of the civilians who wanted to see the remains of the camp, and first of all to preserve those remnants, especially those that were supposed to be destroyed, and some documents which still remained undestroyed. So as I said before, Germans did not manage to destroy everything. They tried to burn documents, but there were still a lot of documents left there when the Soviet army came. But as I said, the commission during its investigation took most of those documents. So what's left is what they didn't notice, and they took those documents to Russia. And there was a leaflet published in a few languages informing about the current situation, current knowledge about Majdanek camp, but it does not compensate for the loss because most of those documents are not available to the researchers, apart from those in Russia who deal with this topic. So the campgrounds were well preserved, and that was good. However, later it was destroyed extensively.
Okay. Proszę Państwa,
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We've got the same in our history. Yes. I would like to kindly thank you for your presentations, for the presents. I hope and I'm convinced that it gave our participants fuller image of relationships in the area of the released camps, whether be it in Poland or Germany, and much information that simply earlier we didn't know about. I want to kindly thank, and to you and the participants, thank you so much. Thank you very much. I also, from my side, once again want to kindly thank you for accepting the invitation and for this extremely interesting discussion, Dr. Sutkiewicz, for the moderation. I also think that the fulfillment of this discussion will be now giving the floor to the survivors who have survived the liberation of all the camps that we've been discussing. I would like to kindly invite all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to see a few video presenting people, survivors who survived and experienced liberation in the camps.
Oczywistą, że w tym morzu okrucieństwa, bestialstwa, tych potwornych zbrodni, których tu dokonywano, była nasza totalna nienawiść, również i moja, w stosunku do wszystkich praktycznie biorąc Niemców. Dlatego, że nawet kapo niemieccy byli najbliższymi współpracownikami SS-manów i wykonawcami, i współmordercami. Stąd między innymi moja działalność w komórce akowskiej na Trzecim Polu. Udało mi się uciec z transportu ewakuacyjnego w Kraśniku przy pomocy wspaniałych kobiet kraśnickich, które zaangażowały się w ratowanie nas tylko dlatego, że byliśmy Polakami, polskimi więźniami politycznymi z Majdanka. Po kilku dniach wróciliśmy do już wolnego Lublina. Zgłosiłem się do Czerwonego Krzyża, tu dowiedziałem się, że na pierwszym polu wśród jeńców niemieckich wziętych przez oddziały radzieckie ukrywają się SS-mani z Majdanka. Bardzo świeżo, jeszcze pod wpływem przeżyć przed 10, 12, 15 dni, pojechałem z Jasiem Wolskim na Majdanek. Tu trafiłem do majora Piwaka i rzeczywiście schwytaliśmy w sumie kilkunastu SS-manów i dwóch kapo Polmana i Sztalpa. Tu Hauptscharführer Gessenmayer, był szturman Vogel, szturman Schelem, to ten, który wyrywał złote zęby więźniom przychodzącym w transportach już w łaźni. I czwarty, który tam był, Obersturmführer Ternes, oficer z administracją, taki buchalter śmierci. Już w tym procesie zeznawałem w 1934 roku tutaj w obecnym klubie garnizonowym, wtedy się nazywał Dom Żołnierza. No to była wielka historia, później było publiczne wieszanie tych ludzi, tych zbrodniarzy na terenie krematoryjnym, przy krematoryjnym na Majdanku w obecności 20 paru tysięcy ludzi. No można zastanawiać się, czy to słuszne, ale wtedy była jakaś potrzeba. Ludzie musieli namacalnie widzieć, że zbrodniarze są karani.
Ewakuacja tego obozu. Wyprowadzono nas rano po apelu na zewnątrz, na tym mrozie. Dano nam podwójną porcję chleba i cały dzień żeśmy stali na dworze. Nie wiem, teraz zimno, człowiek się ubiera, dzieciaki gonią, a dawniej potulnie jeden drugiego plecami rozgrzewał. I staliśmy tak, czekaliśmy, co będzie, że poprowadzą nas gdzie nas poprowadzą. Do szarej godziny. Ciemno się robiło. Oczywiście kobiety stały wcześniej przed nami, my za kobietami. Także mama skombinowała, pracując w jakimś magazynie, nie wiem, koc, przecięła go na pół, że brat miał połowę, ja miałam połowę nakryte na plecach, bo przecież nie było czapki. Z tego kawałka koca też mama zeszyła na pół, żebyśmy okrycie jakieś mieli. Nie wiem, pończoch, były pończochy takie. Nawet szkoda mówić, jak to wyglądało, tak żebracy gorzej, teraz żebrak lepiej ubrany jest. Zaczęli, więzień, taki starszy więzień, zaczął funkcyjny, to chyba był kapo nawet, poza opaską był na ręce, przechodził między nami i przeglądał, w jakich butach jesteśmy, jakie kto ma nogi. A że brat miał tym bandażem papierowym owinięte, odrzucił go z tego szeregu, że się nie nadaje do marszu. Myśmy nie wiedzieli, długo się pójdzie, czy tylko do pociągu, czy co, nie mieliśmy pojęcia. Mnie pozostawiono, a matki już ruszyły, już matki szły. Ja zaczęłam wołać do mamy, wydawało mi się, że mama usłyszy, że brat pozostaje na terenie obozu. Doskoczył do mnie, po nas stali i pilnowali w szeregu żołnierze. Doskoczył do mnie, uderzył mnie bardzo silnie w twarz. Ja ukucłam, żeby mnie bardziej jeszcze nie bił. Ale myśmy już szli, już dzieci szły. Ja pozostałam trochę w tyle. W tym szeregu jeszcze. I ja mówię, brata nie zostawię samego. Niech się robi co chce. Wyskoczyłam z tego szeregu, dołączyłam do brata. Miałam szczęście. Przecież mógł mnie zabić od razu. Dołączyłam do brata i w tej grupce, która pozostała na terenie obozu, zostałam. 26, 27 styczeń. Coraz więcej słychać było wystrzałów, że front jest bardzo blisko. Ta sztubowa babuszka, Janeczka jej było na imię, nie kazała nam wychodzić, bo mówi, że tu jest front. Zabiją was, bo tu się dużo Niemców jeszcze chowa. Nie wolno się rozchodzić. I żeśmy słyszeli, że też w takim baraku obok nas, prawdopodobnie tam były też dzieci schowane, zostały wywiezione w nocy. Tak mówiono, że rozstrzelali je, że teraz chyba nas zabiorą. Chyba. A w godzinach popołudniowych mróz był, ten śnieg taki iskrzący. Widać było, jak ci żołnierze w białych takich kombinezonach z karabinami wbiegają. Bo nasz barak jakoś był przy brzegu, gdzieś ten las. zagajnik taki było widać, jak wpadają więźniowie i się już rzucają na szyję, a oni odganiali. No bo to była linia frontu. Wieczorem do naszego baraku weszło 2 oficerów i pamiętam jak dziś, co wy tu robicie, dzieci, co wy tu robicie? Zaskoczeni, że dzieci są w baraku. No nie było nas dużo, ale była garstka. Rozmawiali z tą babuszką Janeczką i obiecali, żebyśmy się tylko prosili, żebyśmy się nie rozchodzili. Jedzenie nam przyniosą i tego dnia wieczorem, właściwie w nocy, przynieśli kocioł pomidorowej zupy. To był pierwszy taki posiłek, który żeśmy dostali od nich. I nie pozwolili wychodzić. Ale gdzieś w tym tłumie, w tym wszystkim usłyszałam, że grupka kobiet i dzieci, takich starszych, chce wcześnie rano wyjść z obozu. Więc szczerze mówiąc, z bratem nie zastanawiałam się, uciekamy stąd, wychodzimy jak najszybciej. Obojętnie co, gdzie, jeżeli możliwe, dołączymy się do tej grupy i idziemy. Nie wiedziałam, gdzie ten obóz położony, w jakim kierunku, jakie miasta są w pobliżu, ale w tej grupce żeśmy wyszli.
But then one morning we were in the camp looking again for more clothes and more things, and we heard again movement and things, and we saw at the camp, I saw a huge figure standing and all covered in snow and fur, and the first minute I thought it was a bear, and I wasn't quite sure, should I go there or what, and then I went a bit closer and I looked and I saw that it was a man. I saw it was the first Russian soldier who had entered the camp. And one day we went to where the Russian had just left. We looked what they had left behind, and we saw there was a dead horse lying on the frozen ground. And the Polish woman said, I can make a wonderful horse stew out of that. Go back and get a knife and we'll cut this horse open before it gets hard frozen. And I was a bit doubtful, but nevertheless I did that, and we went to get this big knife and we started to cut into this horse, and the tummy part is at the softest, and so we cut out a funny round thing and we carried it to the hut, and she made the fire and we was going to cut it, and when we cut it we saw that it was a womb and it was a little horse in it. And the Russians had shot it because it was pregnant and they couldn't take it along. So we still cut a bit off it and made a stew and ate it. You know, when I think about that I did this, I just think that can't be true, but I know it is true. And I mean, we did have food already, but as I say, we just had to eat all the time, whatever.
To tell you what the feeling was like, I remember when the Jeep rolled in, I said, is it over? This feeling, no. And then the fear, suppose the front pushes back. So you're happy, you're thrilled, you're celebrating, the joy is unbelievable, unbelievable. And then you stop for a moment and you worry, gee, is this a dream? You see, I have to tell you, I used to dream all the time in camp that I was back home, and the dream was always I'm eating delicious foods. And now when this happened, I remember saying to myself, is this a dream or is this reality? I remember getting the first bar of chocolate. A chaplain came in, that was about 2 days later, and he gave me a bar of chocolate. It was like I died and went to heaven. And then he showed me what chewing gum was. And when he gave me the chewing gum, he gave me one piece, and that lasted me for about a week because I kept sticking it behind my ear. I didn't want to lose it.
It was in the afternoon. It was light in the afternoon. The big tank came in, broke the gate, and came in, and the British came in. The British said that we not to drink the water is poisoned, not to eat anything, not to drink anything. They will provide fresh water from there, and we are liberated. So we are free. We went out, and the hurrah went on. The ones who could walk. The other ones what they couldn't. And I said to my brother, the British are here. And he said to me, for me it's too late. And he said to me, David, promise me one thing. I saw that his mouth is going a little bit not straight. I saw that he is very, very, very close to die. And he said to me, please, I beg you, find me my 2 children from Auschwitz and bring me to a Jewish burial. They asked me, and he was so weak that I took him and I said to him, you are only 35, you're not going to die now. And I took him on my hand and I went out on the road in the camp and I sat down in the middle of the road where the tanks are going. And then one tank came along and a soldier came out from the tank and he said, what are you sitting here? And I said to him, my brother's only 35 and he's dying, give him some help. And he said to me, take him to a hospital, here to the hospital. And I carried him like a child. And I carried him to hospital. I've seen my brother died. I was holding the glucose and he died, couldn't make it. And I was so tired, I went to his bed and I lied down on the other side and I fell asleep. Someone woke me up, came in the doctor, and he said to me, your brother is dead. And I said, I know he's dead. He asked me, what religion are you? I said, I'm Jewish. He asked me in Polish. And he took a few minutes, a rabbi came in. He asked me, what do you wish? And I said to him, my brother's wish was to be buried in Jewish burial, but I don't want him to be buried in a mass grave. I want him to be buried in a single grave. And he said, I promise you that. And he said, what else do you want? And I said, bring me in a bucket with hot water and a clean blanket because I want to wash it. So he got me in hot water and I laid him on the floor and I washed him, I cleaned him out, wrapped him in the clean blanket. And then I lost my last brother, and that's the last one in the whole Greenberg family I lost. And I was on my own then. And I was only young, no experience, nothing. So I went home home to my barrack, and that we start to fight for our lives again.
Jak wyszliśmy poza barak, to leżały stosy trupów, góry całe trupów tam leżały. Jak trzeba było wejść do ubikacji, to też leżały całe góry trupów. Ale ja już byłam taka obojętna, że nic mnie już nie obchodziło. Chodziłam po tych stosach, tak jakby nigdy nic, tak jakby też już nie była człowiekiem. Byłam już bardzo wychudzona, ważyłam chyba 30 kilka kilo i tylko leżałam już na dworze. Nie w tym baraku, tylko na dworze leżałam tak. I nie wiem nawet jak długo to tak trwało, aż słyszeliśmy, że Anglicy chcą już oswobodzić nasz lagier, ale nie wejdą wpierw, póki się nie odsprzątnie wszystkich trupów, bo był straszny smród z tych trupów i oni nie chcieli wyjść. Więc pytali się, kto chce ciągnąć tych trupów i dostanie za to zupę. Ja leżałam obojętna, nic mnie nie obchodziło, czy dostanę zupę, czy nie dostanę zupy, ale moja mama poszła i ciągała tych trupów i dostała zupę i przyniosła mi. I to trwało tak, nie wiem, nie pamiętam nawet jak długo. I Anglicy, 15 kwietnia, Anglicy weszli i nas oswobodzili. Nie wiedziałam, czy się mam cieszyć, czy mam płakać, bo ta obojętność u mnie dalej była. I Anglicy zaczęli przynosić od razu jedzenie, widzieli, jacy wychudzeni wszyscy jesteśmy. Zaczęli przynosić puszki z mięsem i widocznie nam nie wolno było tego jeść, bo wszyscy zaczęli chorować. Zaczęli chorować na tyfus, na dezynterię. I moja mama, pamiętam, że nie wiem skąd ona wzięła kartofle, wzięła kocioł i gotowała cały kocioł. Wtedy już mężczyźni też przyszli, bo wyszli, tam widocznie był lagier dla mężczyzn też. Mama ugotowała kocioł z zupą i kto chciał, powiedziała, żeby wszyscy doszli, ona wszystkim dzieliła tą zupę.
Approximately March or April, it was April, in 1945, again, the Germans decided to liquidate Stutthof because the Russians were knocking at the doors. And they took us all out into a large assembly, and they segregated those who were capable of walking from those who were very sick and not capable of walking anymore. I was capable of walking. They put me in one group, and my father was not capable of standing on his feet anymore. They put him in another group. They put us in a marching groups shortly thereafter, after we got back to the assembly. And we marched from Stutthof back to Danzig. We stayed overnight in a holding camp. It's called Rehhagen. That morning in Danzig, we were marched over to the pier, and we were put on a boat, group of approximately maybe 250 people, men and women. The boat was a barge. It was not a boat. It was a barge which was pulled by a tugboat. Of course, the question was, where are we going? Nobody knew where we were going. The SS was not on the barge with us, but they were on the tugboat. We were heading out to the ocean. Very, very desperate times. Speculation, they're going to sink the boat. and throw you overboard. Didn't know how to swim. What's going to happen to you, Bert? Don't know. Needless to say, I didn't sink the boat. Didn't throw it overboard. But we went out to the sea, and we stayed on the sea, North Sea, going in whatever direction we were going into. None of us knew. For, I believe it was 5 or 6 days. No food, no water. After several days, 5 or 6 days, we arrived at a point where the tugboat anchored. They put an anchor on our barge. And it was late in the evening, a tugboat disappeared. We, of course, were wondering what was happening and where we were, but we could see that there was land not too far from where we were anchored. Didn't pay too much attention to it. During the night, we heard tremendous cannon fire, and we realized that we had to be somewhere near the front. Approximately 9:30, we saw British tanks rolling along the road, approximately 500 feet from where we were anchored in the water. And there was no SS, and we were free to make noise and identify ourselves. And they stopped in line with where we were anchored. There were several small boats laying on land, manned the boats, rowed to the boat, to the barge where we were in. And of course, they identified themselves and said they were British soldiers. They were liberating us, which it really was difficult to understand. It was impossible to comprehend. Being liberated, what does it mean? You're cautious, you are afraid. Is it true? What does it mean? Is it possible?
Zbliżamy się do końca naszego
We are
dzisiejszego.
coming close to an end of our today's meeting. Once again, we want to thank all the people, all the panelists and our participants of this meeting. Thank you very much. We realize that certainly we have not managed to tell about everything, compare all the perspectives, but at least we managed to show how broad this topic is and how much there is still it's possible to get to know of, read, listen. And we invite also you now to another educational session that will take place at the end of April. The information about the topic plus a link for the registration formula will soon be available on our website. So I want to kindly once again thank everyone and see you during our next meeting.